My name is Margaret Collins, but most people just call me Maggie. I'm 62, a widow, and for the last 4 years I've been living alone in the house in Akron, Ohio, that my late husband Harold and I once filled with noise, arguments, laughter, and the smell of Sunday roasts. Now it's just me and the hum of the refrigerator. Some nights I can almost hear his cough drifting down the hallway, and it takes everything in me not to open his closet, because the scent of his old flannel jackets would unravel me completely. Before I tell you how it all spiraled, I want you to remember this truth. There's nothing more painful than pouring every ounce of yourself into the people you love, only to be told, by silence, by cold stares, by words that cut, that it still isn't enough. That ache doesn't come from strangers. It comes from the very people you raised, the ones whose hands once clung to yours when they were scared of the dark. And before we dive in, let me pause here. If you've ever felt invisible in your own family, if you've ever carried the weight of everyone else's comfort while no one noticed your breaking spine, please subscribe to this channel. Hit like, share this story, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Stories like mine matter more when we tell them together, so no one has to feel alone in the silence. The story begins in early March, the kind of Ohio March where you can still see your breath at sunrise, but the air carries the faint promise of spring. I spent that morning in the garden, cutting down the last of the frost-burned mums with gloved hands stiff from the cold. The earth was soft but quiet, almost like it was holding its breath with me. I kept thinking how strange it felt to tend a garden for one, dinner for one, laundry for one, whole weeks with no voice but my own. I told myself I was managing, but really, I was surviving on routine, like a woman marking time in a house that was starting to feel more like a museum than a home. I didn't know it then, but this dull ache of loneliness was exactly the crack that would make me easy to exploit. And the voice that broke the silence that day, the phone ringing inside the kitchen, would carry the first thread that pulled the whole story loose. The phone rattled against the kitchen counter, echoing through the quiet like it had no right to. I wiped my garden gloves on my jeans and picked it up, expecting a telemarketer. But the screen lit up with a name I hadn't seen in weeks. Ethan. I hesitated before answering. My son never called just to talk anymore. Something must be wrong. "Hi, Mom." His voice came soft, almost rehearsed. "How are you doing?" I leaned against the counter, staring at the half-dead mums still clinging to the frost outside. "I'm fine," I said lightly. "Keeping busy. The garden, sorting through some of Harold's old things." A lie slipped out before I could stop it. I hadn't touched Harold's closet since the funeral. "That's good," Ethan replied, though his words sounded hollow, like filler before the real message. There was a pause, then a sigh. I could almost see him rubbing the back of his neck, the way he did when he was working up to something. "Listen, Mom, Vanessa and I were talking, and, well, we think maybe you shouldn't be alone so much. The house, it's too big for one person. What if you stayed with us for a while? The kids would love it." My chest tightened. "Stay with you?" I repeated, trying to keep my voice steady. "Yeah, we've got the spare room. Lucas keeps asking when Grandma's coming back, and Emma, she'd be over the moon. You'd be closer to them, and it'd just be good for everyone." I wanted to believe him. I pictured Lucas's messy hair and Emma's gap-toothed grin. For a moment, the idea felt warm, almost hopeful. But then, the last memory of Vanessa flashed across my mind. Her polite smile that never reached her eyes, her phone glued to her hand even at the dinner table. She had never once made me feel like family. Still, Loneliness has a way of softening judgment. I'll think about it, I said finally. Ethan's relief was audible. That's all I'm asking. Think about it. When the call ended, I stood in the kitchen with the phone still warm in my palm. Outside, the garden looked brittle, lifeless. Inside, the silence wrapped around me tighter than ever. I knew I'd spend the next week replaying his offer, weighing the comfort of my empty home against the promise of my grandchildren's laughter. What I didn't know was that this single decision would tilt my life toward a betrayal I could never have imagined. For a week after Ethan's call, his words clung to me like morning frost. Every time I passed Harold's chair or the photos lining the hallway, I felt the silence pressing harder. By the seventh night, I stood in front of my closet with an open suitcase. I didn't pack everything, just sweaters, 2 dresses, my Bible, and the framed wedding photo I couldn't leave behind. The rest of the house stayed untouched, like I was afraid to admit I might not return. The drive from Akron to Cleveland took less than an hour, but it felt much longer. The highway stretched gray and empty, and with every mile I rehearsed what it would be like. Lucas running to hug me, Emma climbing into my lap. I told myself it was worth it, even if Vanessa's smile never quite reached her eyes. When I pulled into their driveway, no one came out. I sat in the car for a moment, gripping the steering wheel. Maybe they didn't hear me. I rang the doorbell twice before Vanessa opened the door. "You're early," she said flatly, stepping aside. I forced a smile. Traffic was lighter than I thought. The living room smelled of reheated takeout and diapers, toys scattered across the floor. The TV blared cartoons no one was watching. A few seconds later, Ethan came down the stairs with Emma on his hip. He hugged me quickly, one-armed, like he was already late for something. "Glad you made it, Mom," he said. "Come on, let me show you your room." The spare room turned out to be more of a storage closet. Boxes lined the walls, an air mattress sagged in the center, and a broken lamp leaned in the corner. There wasn't even space for the small suitcase at my feet. I touched the mattress, its plastic surface cold against my hand. "It'll do," I whispered, though the words tasted like chalk. That night, lying on the airbed, I stared at the ceiling, listening to every sound. The creak of pipes, the hum of the TV, Vanessa's footsteps above me. Nothing felt like home. Still, I told myself this was family, that I was needed. What I didn't yet understand was that I hadn't been invited for love. I had been brought here for a reason I was only beginning to sense. The first week felt like walking on eggshells. I tried to be useful, folding laundry, cooking breakfast, keeping Emma entertained while Lucas played video games. Each small act was my way of saying, I want to belong here, but belonging never came. One morning, I was halfway through folding a basket of clean clothes when Vanessa appeared in the doorway, arms crossed. "Could you not mix the kids' things with ours? I have a system," she said sharply. "Oh, of course," I stammered, setting the t-shirts back down. Her eyes lingered on me as if I had trespassed. Another day, I boiled pasta for dinner while Ethan was upstairs on a conference call. Vanessa walked through the kitchen, scrolling her phone. Without looking up, she muttered, "Don't use the stove in the afternoons. The electric bill's already high." Then she disappeared, leaving me with the pot bubbling angrily behind her. At night, Ethan retreated to the garage with his laptop and a beer. When I asked if everything was okay, he gave me a tired half smile. "Just work stress, Mom. You know how it is." I wanted to tell him I did know, that I'd raised him through nights when the lights almost got cut off, but he was already looking past me, eyes on the glowing screen. I told myself it was temporary, that families had rough patches, that Vanessa's size and Ethan's distance weren't personal. but each interaction chipped away at me. The air mattress hissed under my weight each night, as if reminding me I didn't quite fit. The worst moments were subtle. Vanessa's raised brow when I left the bathroom light on too long, her forced politeness when I offered to buy groceries, Ethan's quick glance at his buzzing phone before shoving it back into his pocket. Nothing was said outright, yet everything screamed, "You're in the way." I had come hoping for laughter and warmth, for the sticky hugs of my grandchildren. Instead, I found myself shrinking in corners, careful not to use too much water, too much heat, too much space. Still, I stayed. Because love convinces you to endure discomfort, to explain away coldness. But deep down, a quiet unease was growing, an ache I couldn't name yet, only sense. And soon, that unease would turn into something undeniable. It happened over dinner one Thursday night. I had made chicken and rice, trying to keep things simple, something everyone might eat without complaint. Lucas and Emma were yawning at the table, pushing peas around their plates. Vanessa scrolled through her phone, her fork clinking absent-mindedly against the dish. Ethan cleared his throat. The sound was small, but heavy, like a stone dropped into still water. "Mom?" he began, eyes fixed on his plate. "I need to ask you something. A little awkward." My stomach tightened. "What is it?" He glanced at Vanessa, who didn't look up from her screen, then back at me. "You know how things have been tight lately. The mortgage on the house? It's been hard keeping up. Just until we get back on track, do you think you could help us cover part of it?" For a moment, the room went silent except for the cartoon still playing faintly in the background. I felt heat rise in my chest. Mortgage? That was no small thing. I looked at Ethan, my son I once stayed up with through fevers, the boy who used to whisper, "Don't leave me, Mama," when storms rattled the windows. Now he was a man asking for money, his voice coated with casualness, like this was normal. "Of course," I heard myself say before my mind caught up. "Just tell me what you need." Ethan's shoulders loosened. He gave me a small smile, quick, almost guilty, and then dug back into his food. Vanessa finally spoke, her tone clipped. "It would help a lot, Margaret. Banks don't wait, and I can't stand living under that kind of stress." She didn't thank me. She just stated it, like my contribution was already expected. That night, lying on the air mattress, I stared at the ceiling with the figures spinning in my head. I dipped into my savings the next morning, wiring enough to cover half the monthly payment. I told myself it was a one-time thing, a mother's way of keeping her son's family afloat. But weeks later, Ethan asked again, and then again. Each request came softer, shorter, but always weighted with expectation. My help was no longer a gift. It had become part of the household budget. I smiled through it, convincing myself that's what mothers do. Yet each transfer chipped something away inside me. Not because of the money itself, but because of the cold silence that followed. No warmth, no gratitude, just the quiet hum of a family that had learned to treat me as an extra line of credit. And still, I told myself, this is what love looks like. By the third month, my savings were shrinking and my patience wearing thin, but I still clung to the idea that love justified sacrifice. That evening, I decided to try something different, something that might remind Ethan of simpler days. I roasted a pot roast, slow cooked with carrots and potatoes, the kind that used to make him run into the kitchen as a boy, grinning ear to ear. I set the table carefully, folded cloth napkins, even lit a single candle in the center. "Dinner's ready," I called, hoping my voice carried warmth instead of desperation. Lucas and Emma bounded down first, plopping into their chairs. Ethan followed with his laptop tucked under one arm. Vanessa trailed last, her phone in hand, not looking up as she slid into her seat. We started eating in near silence, The only sounds, the clatter of forks and the kids' chatter. I tried to start a conversation. You know, when we used to eat together every night, Ethan would always sneak extra carrots onto Harold's plate. Mom, Ethan muttered, eyes fixed on the screen of his laptop. I pressed on gently. I just think maybe if we all sat down more often, the kids would eat better. Family dinners matter. That's when Vanessa finally looked up. Her eyes were sharp, her lips pressed tight. You always have little comments, Margaret, she said, voice cool but edged with steel. Like we don't know how to run our own house. My fork froze halfway to my mouth. I didn't mean... She cut me off, dropping her utensil with a loud clink that echoed. You talk a lot for someone who doesn't actually contribute enough to this family to be making suggestions. The words slammed into me harder than any shove. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. Across the table, Lucas blinked in confusion. Emma's small hand clutched at her cup. Ethan didn't lift his eyes from the laptop. He just shifted in his seat, silent. I swallowed, the roast suddenly dry as ash in my throat. My hands trembled under the table, but I forced myself to rise slowly, keeping my voice even. I'll clear my plate, I whispered, carrying it to the sink. The candle flickered between us, its light too soft for a moment so cruel. Behind me, Vanessa sighed, picked up her phone again, and began scrolling as if nothing had happened. I rinsed my dish in silence, staring at the water spiraling down the drain. All the nights I had gone hungry so Ethan could eat, all the bills I had paid, the clothes I had mended, the love I had poured, it all dissolved into that single sentence. Not enough. When I retreated to the air mattress that night, I didn't cry. I sat stiffly on the edge, staring at the cracked lamp in the corner, replaying the scene until the words etched themselves onto my bones. That was the moment I knew. I wasn't family here. I was an obligation disguised as help, a wallet dressed up as love. And the cracks in my heart were only beginning to split wide open. That night, after the humiliating dinner, I couldn't sleep. The air mattress hissed under me with every restless turn, and Vanessa's words replayed in my head like a cruel lullaby. You don't contribute enough to this family. My chest felt tight, like someone had cinched a belt around my ribs. Around midnight, I gave up on sleep and slipped quietly down the hall. Maybe a glass of water would calm me. The house was mostly dark, except for a sliver of light leaking from the kitchen. I slowed my steps when I heard voices, low, tense. Ethan. Vanessa. I froze just out of sight, my back pressed to the wall. She's been covering half the mortgage for months, Ethan muttered, his voice taut with worry. But it's not enough. The card companies keep calling. I can't keep juggling this. Vanessa's reply was sharp, impatient. Then keep her here. You brought her in, Ethan. Now make her useful. She's lonely. She'll give. Stop acting like you don't know how this works. My stomach dropped. I hate asking her, Ethan whispered. She looks at me like I'm still her little boy. And that's why she'll keep paying. Vanessa cut in. She'll bleed herself dry before she says no. You think I'm giving up my weekends or my shopping because you can't control yourself? The sound of glass clinking against the counter. Ethan's voice fell to a whisper I barely caught. It's not just bills. I lost more than I meant to. Online. You mean gambling? Vanessa snapped. Don't sugarcoat it. You lost thousands, Ethan. And guess what? Your mother is the only reason we're still in this house. So either keep her close or watch us drown. My knees weakened. I gripped the wall to stay upright, bile rising in my throat. Gambling. My son. The boy I had sacrificed meals for. The man I had just emptied my savings to help. Had been lying, funneling my love into a pit he couldn't crawl out of. And Vanessa. She wasn't just cold, she was complicit. She wanted me here. Not for family, not for love, but as their safety net. I stumbled back to my room, silent tears sliding down my face. The ceiling loomed above me like a cage. I had thought I was protecting them. In truth, I was their pawn. The next morning, as I tried to keep my hands steady pouring cereal for the kids, Lucas looked up at me with a grin. "Grandma, did you see Dad's secret game? The one with the spinning wheels and the fireballs?" He giggled, mimicking tapping on an invisible screen. "He always plays it at night when Mom gets mad." Emma chimed in with innocent excitement. "Daddy says it's his special game. He talks to people on the phone, too. They sound scary." My heart cracked. I forced a smile, brushing Emma's hair behind her ear, though my voice wavered. "Eat your breakfast, sweet pea." They had no idea. They thought their father was just playing games. They couldn't understand that he was gambling their stability away, with my money keeping the roof over their heads. When the kids ran off to the living room, I stayed frozen at the table, staring at the half-empty cereal bowls. The betrayal had settled, not as a sharp stab, but as a slow, spreading poison. The truth was out now. I couldn't unhear it. Couldn't unsee the way Ethan avoided my eyes. Couldn't forget Vanessa's cold calculation. The woman who had once sung lullabies into Ethan's feverish ears had become nothing more than a paycheck in their kitchen. And for the first time, I realized this wasn't just neglect. It was a plan that had my name written all over it. The next morning, I moved through the house like a ghost. My hands poured coffee, packed lunches, tied Emma's shoes, yet my mind was already elsewhere, calculating. The conversation I overheard had stripped away the last illusions. I wasn't family here. I was a wallet with a heartbeat. While they were busy upstairs getting the kids ready for school, I opened Ethan's laptop, the one he left charging on the kitchen counter. The gambling site was still logged in, spinning wheels frozen mid-animation. My hands trembled, but not from fear, this time from clarity. I printed the bank statements I had access to, every charge, every loss, each one like a knife wound I hadn't realized was mine to bear. By the time the printer spat out the last page, I already knew what I would do. I slid the stack of papers into a manila envelope and wrote 2 words across the front in neat cursive. "For you." On top, I placed a small note card, my handwriting steady despite the storm inside me. "Thank you for letting me stay." I packed quietly that afternoon, folding the same sweaters I had unpacked weeks ago, tucking Harold's photo between them. Each zip of the suitcase sounded like a door closing. Lucas poked his head into the hallway as I rolled the bag toward the front door. "Grandma, are you going somewhere?" My throat tightened. I bent down, brushing his cheek with my hand. "Just for a little while, sweetheart. Remember, I love you bigger than the sky." His innocent nod nearly broke me, but I forced myself to stand. If I lingered, I would lose my resolve. When the house finally emptied, Ethan at work, Vanessa on errands, the children at school, I set the envelope squarely in the center of the kitchen table, where it couldn't be ignored. The sunlight streamed through the blinds, striking it like a spotlight on a stage. I pulled my suitcase over the threshold, the door clicking shut behind me. No one came running. No one noticed. The silence was louder than any goodbye. Driving back toward Akron, the miles unspooled beneath my tires. For the first time in months, the air felt lighter, though my chest was raw. I hadn't screamed, hadn't accused, hadn't begged. I had left them with the truth, cold, undeniable, waiting for them like a mirror they couldn't turn away from. They thought they had cornered me, but they didn't know I had just made my first move. When I pulled into my driveway in Akron, the house stood there like an old friend waiting patiently, slightly sagging, paint chipped in places, but still mine. The porch light had burned out weeks ago, Yet the sight of it filled me with more comfort than the entire time I'd spent under Ethan's roof. I hauled my suitcase inside. The air was heavy with dust and silence, but it welcomed me in a way no crowded living room with cartoon noise ever had. Harold's photo still sat on the mantel, his familiar smile frozen in time. My slippers were right where I'd left them by the bedroom door. It was as if the house had been holding its breath, waiting for me to come back. I sank into a chair at the kitchen table, pulled out my phone, and opened the banking app. For months, I had been transferring money with a trembling hope that it was saving my son. Now, I knew it had only been feeding his lies. One by one, I canceled the automatic transfers. Mortgage, canceled. Utilities, canceled. The emergency card linked to his account, canceled. Each click felt like cutting a string that had been wrapped tight around my throat. By the time I closed the app, my chest felt lighter, though my hands shook with the finality of it. The phone buzzed almost instantly. Ethan. Then another text. Did you make it home safe? I stared at the words, the gall of pretending nothing had happened. Minutes later, another. Things got weird, but we'll figure it out. Maybe we can talk soon? No apology. No acknowledgement of Vanessa's cruelty or his own deceit. Just the hollow voice of a man worried about his safety net walking away. I set the phone face down on the table. The silence of my home wrapped around me. Not the suffocating silence of neglect, but a clean, honest quiet. I heated a frozen meal, sat at the same table I'd eaten at with Harold so many times, and chewed each bite with a strange kind of pride. For the first time in months, the food tasted like mine. The roof was mine. The air was mine. And so was the choice to never again let them bleed me dry. The first week back in Akron felt like waking from a long, bruising dream. I scrubbed the floors, polished Harold's old dresser, even washed curtains that hadn't seen sunlight in years. Not because the house needed it, but because I did. Each stroke of the rag was a way of reclaiming space, telling myself, this is mine. I exist here. Yet when the chores ended, the silence pressed in again. I would sit at the kitchen table, tea cooling in my hands, staring at Harold's photograph on the mantel until my throat ached. I hadn't spoken aloud in days, and when the phone buzzed with Ethan's number, I let it ring until the screen went black. One morning, I saw a flyer at the library. Grief and Growth Counseling, accepting new clients. I stood staring at it longer than I'd admit. Therapy had always felt like something other people did, but hadn't silence already swallowed me enough? The following week, I found myself on a small couch across from a soft-eyed woman named Karen. For the first time in years, tears came without warning. I told her about Harold's quiet selfishness, about Ethan's gambling, about Vanessa's disdain. The words spilled out like a dam breaking. Karen didn't rush to fill the silence. She just looked at me, really looked, and that alone felt like oxygen. After 3 sessions, I realized something. I wasn't broken because I had been left behind. I was broken because I kept erasing myself for others. That night, I pulled Harold's old sewing machine from the attic. Dust coated its edges, the pedal stiff under my foot. I hadn't touched it since before he got sick, back when I used to stitch Halloween costumes for Ethan and pillows for the church bazaar. The first stitches were crooked, my hands rusty, but soon the rhythm returned. I started with small things, tote bags, aprons, a patchwork quilt. On a whim, I listed a few online. To my surprise, strangers bought them. They sent messages like, "Your stitching reminds me of my grandma's." For the first time in years, I felt valued not as a mother or a helper, but as me. I bought a fresh journal. On the first page, I wrote in bold black ink, "I am not invisible. I am not disposable. I am a woman who deserves peace." It became my mantra. Each morning, I repeated it before starting the day. The house felt lighter, not because Harold's absence hurt less, but because I was no longer trying to fill the void with people who only saw me as a resource. And while I stitched under the warm glow of the lamp, I knew I wasn't done. My story wasn't over. The more I stitched, the steadier my hands became. But while my life slowly found rhythm again, theirs began to fall apart. And I didn't even need to knock on their door to see it. At first, it was subtle. Vanessa's Instagram, once a gallery of latte art and matching family outfits, grew sparse. The captions shrank to a single emoji. Lucas and Emma no longer smiled in polished holiday clothes. Instead, their shirts looked wrinkled, their hair uncombed. One Friday evening, curiosity got the better of me. I opened the neighborhood resale app, scrolling past secondhand bikes and lawnmowers. Then I froze. Lightly used sectional sofa, must pick up. Urgent. The photo was unmistakable. The throw pillows I had sewn 2 Christmases ago were stacked neatly on the cushions. A week later, another listing. Vanessa's designer handbags, captioned, DM for details, serious buyers only. The woman who once sneered at me for leaving the bathroom light on was now pawning off the image she'd built piece by piece. I should have felt vindicated, but my chest ached. Lucas used to curl into me on that couch with a blanket, whispering his little secrets. Now it was being sold to strangers. And then came the SUV. One afternoon, a neighbor posted photos from a block party. Balloons, kids running in sprinklers. In the background, their driveway sat empty, except for a dented sedan I didn't recognize. Vanessa had traded her spotless luxury for survival. Weeks later, I ran into Ethan at the grocery store. I spotted him first, behind a pyramid of canned soup. He didn't notice me, or maybe he pretended not to. His shoulders slumped under a faded hoodie, the same one I had patched 3 winters ago. His cart held generic cereal, frozen pizza, a box of baby wipes. No steak, no wine, no organic anything. For one trembling second, I wanted to step forward, to say, "Ethan, let me take the kids this weekend. Let me help." But then Vanessa's voice rang in my head. "You don't contribute enough to be making suggestions." So I stayed hidden, watching my son shuffle past, pale and hollow-eyed. That night, I cooked myself a real meal: roast chicken, vegetables, a glass of red wine. I lit a candle not for them, but for me. As I ate, I whispered aloud for the first time in months, "I am enough." The truth was clear. Their house of cards was collapsing, and for once, I wasn't the glue holding it together. And though it broke my heart to see Lucas and Emma caught in the wreckage, I knew I had drawn a line. They would feel my absence, and Ethan would learn, painfully, what it meant to lose the one person who had always picked up the pieces. It was a Tuesday evening when the call came. I was folding laundry in the living room, the hum of the dryer filling the silence. At first, I let the phone buzz across the counter, assuming it was another spam number. But when I glanced at the screen, my heart stumbled. Ethan. I almost didn't answer. But something in me, maybe a mother's instinct, pushed my hand forward. "Mom!" His voice cracked, raw and jagged. "Please, I need to see you." The next afternoon, I heard tires crunch on the gravel of my driveway. Through the window, I saw him climb out of a compact sedan that looked borrowed, not owned. He walked up the steps slower than I had ever seen, shoulders caved inward, like he was carrying bricks strapped to his chest. "Can I come in?" he asked when I opened the door. His voice was small. I nodded, stepping aside. He sat on the edge of the couch, wringing his hands. His eyes were hollow, rimmed red. For a long moment, he just stared at the floor. Finally, he spoke, the words tumbling out in a whisper. I messed up, Mom. Worse than I ever told you. I think I'm addicted. Online betting. It started small, just a few games. But every time I lost, I thought I could win it back. And then, his voice cracked. Now it's thousands. The mortgage is months behind. Vanessa's talking about leaving. The kids. They ask why it's so cold some nights when we can't pay the heat. I swallowed hard, my palms pressed against my knees. Part of me wanted to reach out, to cradle his head the way I did when he was 10 and sobbing after losing a baseball game. But another part, the one scarred by his betrayal, sat stone still. He looked up at me then, eyes glistening. Please, Mom, just this once. I swear I'll pay you back. I just need a push. We need you. Silence stretched between us, heavy as iron. I could hear the clock ticking on the mantel, each second cutting deeper. Finally, I stood, walked slowly to the front door and opened it. The night air rushed in, cool against my burning cheeks. Not today, Ethan, I said softly, but firm. He blinked, stunned. What? I'm your son. You can't just... I loved you through every storm, I interrupted, my voice trembling but steady. I gave until there was nothing left of me. And you watched it happen. You let it happen. So now you will have to live in the silence you created. For the first time, a tear slid down his cheek. I'm sorry, he whispered. And this time, I believed him, but it wasn't enough. He left quietly, no door slam, no angry words. Just the slow shuffle of a man learning the weight of his own mistakes. That night, I wept. Not for Ethan, but for the woman I used to be. The one who thought love meant saving everyone but herself. 3 weeks passed with nothing but silence. No texts, no calls, no desperate knocks at the door. At first, I mistook the quiet for abandonment. But then I realized it wasn't punishment. It was space. Space I had needed for years. One chilly Saturday morning, just as I was pulling on my coat to head to the post office, there was a knock. I opened the door to find Ethan standing there. His hair was longer, his beard unkempt, but his eyes were different, less frantic, less hollow. Tired, yes, but honest in a way I hadn't seen in years. Can I come in? He asked softly. I stepped aside without a word. He sat on the couch, this time not like a man begging for rescue, but like someone asking for a place to rest. His hands twisted together nervously. I started going to meetings, he said finally. Gamblers Anonymous, Tuesdays and Saturdays. It's hard, but I go. I stayed quiet, just listening. He needed to speak, not be interrupted. I sold the SUV, he continued. Canceled the credit cards. Picked up a delivery job at night. Doesn't pay much, but it's something. I'm trying, Mom. I really am. His voice cracked, but he didn't look away. For a moment, I saw the boy he used to be. The one who stayed up late building Lego towers and swore he'd grow up to be someone strong, like Dad. But this wasn't the same boy. This was a man finally facing the rubble of his choices. Then he lowered his head. I'm scared. The mortgage is still 2 months behind. Vanessa's angry all the time. The kids hear everything. I don't want to lose them, but I can't do this alone. He looked up at me, eyes brimming. I don't just need money. I need structure. I need you to teach me how to stop leaning on everyone else. The room felt heavy. My heart ached, torn between the instinct to cradle him and the hard truth that I couldn't be his savior anymore. I excused myself, walked into the kitchen, and returned with a folder I had prepared for months, just in case. Inside was a payment plan, a budget sheet, and a list of rehab resources. I placed it in his lap. "These are my terms," I said evenly. "I'll help cover the past due amount one time. Enough to keep the bank from taking the house. But after that, you stand on your own 2 feet. If you skip a meeting, if I see one charge from a betting site, if you refuse to separate finances from Vanessa, I'm out. For good." His hands trembled as he flipped through the papers. He looked at me, eyes wide. Then slowly, he nodded. "Okay." For the first time, I didn't feel like I was bending to save him. I felt like I was setting the ground rules of survival. And maybe, just maybe, he was finally ready to follow them. Ethan sat hunched on my couch, the folder open in his lap. His thumb ran along the edge of the budget sheet, as though stalling for time. I watched him carefully, my arms folded across my chest. "You've read it?" I said, breaking the silence. "Do you understand what I'm asking?" He nodded slowly. "Yeah, 1 bailout, then structure. No gambling, no excuses." His voice cracked, but he forced it steady. "I get it." I leaned forward. "There's more. You separate your finances from Vanessa. No joint accounts, no shared credit cards. You're responsible for your money, and she's responsible for hers." His head snapped up, eyes wide. "Mom, you don't understand. That'll blow everything up. She'll lose it." I held his gaze, refusing to flinch. "Good, maybe she should. You can't rebuild your life if she still holds the purse strings, or if you're funding her lifestyle while you're drowning." He shook his head, fingers gripping the papers so tightly they crumpled. "She'll say I'm abandoning her, that I don't trust her." "Do you?" I asked quietly. The question lingered like smoke between us. His mouth opened, then closed. Finally, he whispered, "Not anymore." I softened my tone, but not my resolve. "Then stop pretending. This is the line, Ethan. If you want my help, this is the cost." Not money, discipline, boundaries. The kind you never learned because I kept rescuing you. His hands trembled as he set the folder down. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he whispered, "What if I fail?" "Then you fail on your own terms," I said. "Not with my savings, not with your kids' future tied to roulette wheels. You stand or you fall, but this time, it's you." Tears welled in his eyes. He rubbed his face roughly, as if trying to wipe away years of excuses. "Okay," he said hoarsely. "I'll do it. I'll open my own account, cancel the joint cards, whatever it takes." I stood, extending my hand, not like a mother offering comfort, but like a partner sealing a deal. "Then we begin here." He hesitated, then grasped my hand firmly. For the first time in years, I felt strength in his grip instead of dependence. When he left that night, the folder tucked under his arm, I knew the path ahead would not be smooth. Vanessa's fury would come. The temptation of late-night betting apps would whisper again. The bills would pile up. But as the door clicked shut, I also knew something had shifted. Ethan wasn't leaning anymore. He was standing, shaky, but standing. And for the first time, the fight wasn't mine to carry. The weeks that followed felt like walking on thin ice. Ethan showed up at my house every Sunday evening with receipts, budget notes, and the weary look of a man balancing on a wire. He'd spread the papers on my kitchen table like a student facing his teacher. Groceries, $120. Utilities, $90. Gas, $60. His voice was steady, though his fingers drummed nervously. No gambling charges. I'd scan the statements, my eyes sharp. For once, he didn't flinch under my scrutiny. He looked almost relieved to be held accountable. But the real test wasn't me, it was Vanessa. One night, Ethan slumped into the chair across from me, his face pale. "She lost it, Mom. When I told her I was separating our finances, she said I was abandoning her. Called me selfish." "And what did you say?" I asked, my voice calm but firm. He rubbed his temples. "I told her the truth, that if I didn't take control, I'd lose everything. The house, the kids, myself." His hands dropped, and for the first time in months, his eyes didn't dart away. She didn't believe me, but I didn't back down. I sat there quietly, pride and sorrow twisting together in my chest. Ethan had always folded under pressure, first as a boy, then as a husband. Now, for once, he was holding the line. Still, the strain showed. His clothes hung looser, his beard scruffy. But beneath it, I saw something new, a spine straightening inch by inch. One Saturday, he arrived later than usual carrying 2 pizza boxes. "For the kids," he explained, setting them down. Lucas and Emma burst in from the living room, their laughter filling my quiet house like sunlight. Ethan joined them on the floor, helping Emma with her homework, while Lucas clung to his arm. I watched from the doorway, my throat tight. For so long, I had feared Ethan was lost to his own weakness. Yet here he was, reading multiplication tables in a soft, steady voice. Not perfect, not healed, but trying. When the kids ran off, Ethan looked up at me. "I don't know if Vanessa and I are going to make it," he admitted. "She still wants the old life. The cars, the shopping, the dinners out. I can't give her that anymore. I don't want to." I reached across the table, covering his hand with mine. "Then don't. Build the life you can live with. Build it for them." I nodded toward the children's laughter echoing down the hall. His eyes brimmed with tears, but this time they weren't the tears of a desperate man begging for rescue. They were the tears of someone finally fighting for his own future. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to believe maybe this wasn't just survival anymore. Maybe it was the beginning of a new life. For both of us. Spring crept into Akron slowly, like the earth itself was testing if it was safe to bloom again. By then, months had passed since Ethan had first walked back into my living room with trembling hands and hollow eyes. Now, he stood taller. Not perfect, not unscarred, but different. One afternoon, he pulled up in a modest second-hand sedan with Lucas and Emma in the back. They tumbled out, carrying boxes, giggling as they tried to race each other up my front steps. Ethan followed with a quiet smile. "New place," he said, handing me a set of spare keys. Not boastful, just steady. "It's not much, a duplex near the kids' school. But I paid the deposit myself. The bills are in my name. And for the first time, I don't feel like I'm drowning." I studied his face. He'd gained some weight back. The color returned to his cheeks. His eyes no longer darted with shame, but met mine directly. For the first time in years, I believed him. Inside, the kids spread their drawings across my kitchen table, their chatter like music in the house that had been too quiet for too long. Ethan leaned against the counter. "Mom, I'm not asking for money anymore. I'm asking for accountability. Check my budget. Ask the hard questions. I want to earn this life, not borrow it." I felt a lump rise in my throat. I reached across the counter and squeezed his hand. "That's all I ever wanted for you. To stand on your own, not on me." Later that evening, after they'd left, I lit a candle beside Harold's photograph. Not in mourning this time, but in gratitude for the strength I had found in myself. for the chance to see my son fight his way back to being the man I always hoped he could be. The road ahead would be messy. Vanessa hadn't disappeared. She was still in the picture, still sharp-edged, still unwilling to let go of her old life. But Ethan was no longer tangled in her chaos. He was learning to walk away when he needed to, and that was enough, for now. For the first time in years, I felt truly free. Not because my son was fixed. He wasn't. Not because the pain of betrayal had vanished. It hadn't. But because I had finally chosen myself, and in doing so, I had given him the space to choose himself too. If you've stayed with me through this journey, here's what I've learned. Love without boundaries isn't love. It's surrender. I spent years believing sacrifice was the highest proof of motherhood. I gave until I vanished, and still, it wasn't enough. But sometimes, the most loving thing you can do for the people you care about is step back and let them face their own storms. I watched my son fall apart. I watched him gamble away not just money, but trust, dignity, and peace. And I almost lost myself trying to save him. But when I finally said no, when I drew the line, I discovered something powerful. I wasn't just protecting myself. I was giving him the chance to stand, maybe for the first time in his life. If you're listening to this and carrying the weight of someone else's choices, hear me. You are not selfish for setting limits. You are not cruel for saying enough. Sometimes the bravest act of love is letting go. If this story touched you, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe for more, share it with someone who might need these words, and leave your thoughts in the comments. Your voice matters, and you are never alone.